Yeah, we've been very fortunate to have a really wonderful audience for these conversations.
Wow.
Yeah.
So are you doing the interviewing?
I am. I'm Julie, by the way, Julie Mountcastle.
Glad to finally meet you, Julie, in person. So
Nice to meet you as well.
I do have a hard stop right at 7, just FYI.
Thank
Um,
you for letting me know. We'll be all set.
okay.
So we'll get started right now. So welcome to Slate School's Idea Lab and tonight's conversation about creating innovators and learning by heart with Tony Wagner. Slate School is committed to excellence in education, and we are delighted to present the Education Idea Lab, which is a new, unique virtual series that is free and open to the public. And this thought-leading event convenes leaders, change makers, and participants from all sectors of education and innovation. So thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have all of you here with us today. My name is Julie Mountcastle, and I'm head of school at Slate School. So I'll briefly introduce you to Slate School, and we'll then hear from our extraordinary guest. Slate School is an independent 501c3 nonprofit elementary school where education is focused on cultivating creativity, fostering ingenuity, and inspiring a deep passion for lifelong learning. At Slate School, we formed a community that is constantly striving to improve practice, to create meaningful educational experiences for learners of all ages, and to change the landscape in education. Slate School convenes experts for important, authentic conversations about education, and these online dialogues, like today's, are free and open to the public. So we're so delighted to have all of you with us today. We have learners joining us from 49 countries and from 6 continents. So tonight's conversation with Tony Wagner is our first of the year, and we have received some amazing questions from our community. And we'll actually we're inviting you now to submit additional questions as comments on Facebook, and we'll select some of those questions to share tonight as well. So our amazing guest. Globally recognized expert in education, Tony Wagner is currently a senior research fellow at the Learning Policy Institute. Previously, he held a variety of positions at Harvard University for more than 20 years, including 4 years as expert in residence at the Harvard Innovation Lab and the founder and co-director for more than a decade of the Change Leadership Group at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His previous work experience includes 12 years as a high school teacher, K-8 principal, university professor in teacher education, founding executive director of Educators for Social Responsibility. Tony is a frequent speaker at national and international conferences and a widely published author. His work includes Most Likely to Succeed, Preparing Our Kids for the Innovation Era, which was co-authored by Ted Dintersmith. And his other publications include Creating Innovators, The Making of Young People Who Will Change the World, The Global Achievement Gap, and his most recent book, Learning by Heart and Unconventional Education. Tony served as the strategic education advisor for a major education documentary, Most Likely to Succeed, which had its world premiere at the 2015 Sundance Film Festival. He also collaborated with noted filmmaker Robert Compton to create a 60-minute documentary, The Finland Phenomenon Inside the World's Most Surprising School System, in 2010. And that has made me very nervous because what an incredible career you're having, my friend. Wow. That's just awesome. So welcome, Tony, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Julie. It's a pleasure. And remind me to shorten that bio next time. It takes up way too much time. That's what, we
Absolutely
only
not.
have time for 3 more questions, right?
Well, you have to quit being so awesome then.
No, I have to shorten my bio then. I
Well,
usually tell people to just cut and paste and pick whatever interests them, not to read the whole thing.
it's pretty great though. And I think, we have people joining us from everywhere, and maybe for some of those people, it's their first introduction to you, and they should know all of the wonderful things that you bring to this conversation. So I'm glad we shared it.
Thank you.
But let's jump right in. So I don't know. I've got a million questions, but let's go for something right at the very core of it. I know you've written about this, but what do you say? What would you say is the purpose of education? And I guess I'm wondering, in all of your experience, has your answer to that question changed over time?
Interestingly, it's actually not. When I was a young teacher, well, I'll take it back a half a step or two, and I'm drawing from my new memoir, Learning by Heart, if you
Yes.
want to hear more of this story. But, I dropped out of high school once, dropped out of college twice, was very involved in the civil rights and then the peace movement. And along the way, I met a close disciple of Gandhi's, Narayan Desai. And I very pretentiously asked him at a conference, um, in a quiet conversation, what was his definition of revolution, because he was a social revolutionary. And he said, revolution is the dynamic process of transforming individual virtues into social values. And I put that on my application to the Master of Arts in Teaching program at Harvard, and miraculously they let me in. But, a few years later, I began reading the work of the Swiss developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. That it really helped me have a theoretical understanding of what I was intuitively already doing as a teacher. And his view of the goal of education is to overcome egocentrism in two domains. Intellectually, he says, overcoming egocentrism means learning to reason, to weigh evidence over superstition or uninformed beliefs. Emotionally, he said, overcoming egocentrism means learning what he called reciprocity, but what we would call, I think, empathy. And has always stayed with me as the most succinct definition of the purpose of education. More recently, yes, I've talked and written about education should prepare all kids for work, learning, and citizenship in the 21st century. But even that, I think, can be distilled back down to Piaget's wonderful, concise definition.
Awesome, awesome. That sort of takes me to thinking about. I learned about Piaget when I was becoming an educator, and I think a lot of young educators in educator training programs, they hear about Piaget and Vygotsky and a lot of great minds about education, but I'm not sure that we're actually being prepared to be
No.
the cultivator of revolutionaries and thinkers. And so I'm wondering, what's your advice to someone who's maybe in school, somebody who's pursuing this, or somebody who's already a teacher? How do we press programs to really prepare us?
I think teacher preparation programs, frankly, are a national disaster. Uh, Schools of education, by and large, are cash cows for large state universities. They subsidize engineering programs and others that are far more expensive. And so I don't think they give the time and attention to real supervision as well as to relevant coursework. So I created my own. I had the same problem at Harvard doing the master's program and then later doing a doctorate at Harvard. And so I just followed my own curiosity and created my own reading lists of things that I thought were particularly interesting or important. I had never read any John Dewey, so I dove into Dewey. And others like him, Maria Montessori, another example, that were not on any of my course syllabi, but which I had heard about and thought interesting or important. Now, once one gets into the profession, I think you first have to understand, I think, coming from a mediocre or poor preparation background as I did, with no meaningful supervision, it took me 5 years to become, I think, a good teacher through too much trial and error. So much so, in fact, that I'm inclined to issue a notice to my first 3 years of students, a kind of a recall notice. Come back and get what you didn't get. But, I struggled with having colleagues all of my teaching career, and I write about this in my memoir, As a young teacher, I desperately wanted people with whom I could bounce ideas off of and learn from and with. And so, my advice to a young teacher today: buddy up. Isolation is the enemy of improvement, isolation is the enemy of innovation. One reason there is so little of both in education is because we teachers are so profoundly isolated, working alone all day, every day. So I say, find a buddy or even two, make it a study group, and get together and talk education ideas, visit each other's classes, learn to get comfortable with giving and receiving feedback.
You talk about this in your book, and I mean, I do think teaching can be a very lonely profession.
Yes.
And I think it's destructive in so many ways for it to be lonely. It's you want to have people in the room to share the glorious moments, and then you want to have somebody in the room to say, hey, you missed the mark there.
I agree.
This is not what you this is, I know this isn't what you meant to be doing. And I'm wondering why districts are so slow to embrace this idea of professional learning communities where teachers are, I mean, where time is given for teachers to go into each other's classrooms and observe their work and be with them and share. What's your thought about that?
Well, I think it's complicated. I think the problem is we've organized schools in the same way for a century. It's the egg crate form of organization, right? Where everybody's got their own little cell. And so the challenge is to create an entirely different kind of school calendar that builds in time for collaboration. And I don't just mean a one-off once a week or 3 times a month professional development. I mean communities of practice working to understand and solve problems of practice. That's the engine of continuous improvement, both for us as individuals and for our profession. But we don't think that. We think tests are going to be the magical engine of continuous improvement. And of course, that's proven not to be the case.
We got to get
So
to
I
that.
think, the challenge is to question conventional wisdom, whether it's what learning looks like or what good school organization or a good school calendar looks like.
Yeah. I'm struck by the idea. I mean, when I read your book, your newest book, Learning by Heart, I was struck by how many really just kind of disastrous educational experiences you had. And yet,
Yes.
in your life, you seem to have this innate trust and idea and belief that education is good. You kept going back. And where did that come from? And
I was
how
a very slow learner. What can I say?
well, thank God.
Well, no, I think I was always curious. From a very, very young age, I learned the habit of reading and loved it. And that fed me, right? And then I was curious, but, in a somewhat horrified way, at all the things going around me, coming of age in the late 50s, then early 60s, then well into the 60s. Why was there racism? Was the Vietnam War a war against communist aggression or a civil war? These things drove me as a learner, and often in spite of school, not because of school. It gets back to, I think, the importance of curiosity. Maybe it was my early learning habits and reading. I was curious. I was always asking questions. I was a terrible annoyance to parents and teachers and everybody else. But to me, that I think is more than anything else what drove me, my questions. And that comes back to one of my pieces of advice for parents and educators today is have kids keep a question journal. Have them write down the questions or concerns that they have and take them seriously, give them time to voice them, and then to go read about them. To me, the wellspring of not just learning, but also innovation, which, as you know, I studied, is this kind of lifelong curiosity.
Yeah. I'm wondering, in these days when we have, the instant gratification from the internet, and you talk about this in global achievement gap. You know, when the answers are easy to get, how do we keep kids, being invested in wallowing in the complexity?
Yeah. I think it's
Loving
a
the
huge
unknown.
challenge, especially as kids are now addicted to their devices and their social media platforms.
Yeah, and we're depending on Zoom now, right, for a lot of things that we didn't depend on even previously, a year ago, even.
To me, a lot of it comes in dialogue and sharing. The more kids have a chance to share their questions, to have a conversation, to be sometimes gently challenged or otherwise coached or encouraged in meaningful interactions with adults, I think that's how we move it forward. We're born curious, creative, imaginative. That's the human DNA. And the challenge for education is, instead of stifling that, to strengthen it like a muscle and to make that one of our ultimate and most important goals.
I don't want to give away everything from your book, but how
That's okay. Be right ahead.
how much do you credit summer camp with?
Well, that's, as you know, um, a significant chunk of my early years. What saved me, I was a disaster in school. Just asked not to return to my middle school because I never studied. I found school so darn boring. But I got sent away to a boys' camp, much like a camp for Boy Scouts. And I had always loved the out of doors. I was born on a farm and loved roaming the countryside by myself. But at the camp, I had opportunities to study with a Native American, full-blooded Cherokee Indian and learn Indian lore and Indian dancing. I had an opportunity to be a mentee or an apprentice to a very elderly man who was a real expert with an axe. And I earned my axemanship ribbon, equivalent to a scouting badge. So in many ways, these informal learning experiences gave me a taste of what school can and should be.
Yeah, I wonder if there's room in the purpose of education for that sort of camp experience, and how do we build that into that definition? Because it seems like it's so important for kids.
I agree. I don't have an easy answer for that, but I certainly think, we can build outdoor education into every school curriculum, and we should. I think we squander far too much money on very expensive varsity sports, money that could be far better spent getting kids out into the woods for a weekend or a week. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but boy, if you've only got a limited school budget for, quote, physical activities, get kids outside.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm lucky, Tony. I don't know how much you know about my school here, but I'm so fortunate. We're, K to 6 at, on 25 acres.
Wow.
We have, 1 acre of disruption for buildings, and the rest of it is dry meadow, piney woods, stream corridor, wetlands. So I mean, you're singing from my playbook, actually.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I learned this actually in another way in Finland. For every hour of lessons in Finland, there's 15 minutes of recess. And even in the worst weather, kids are thrown out unsupervised onto the playgrounds, and they just love it. And there's a little bit of sensibleness about it. So, for example, in the heart of winter, there's 2 playgrounds, a snowball-free playground and a snowball playground. But the Finns have understood the importance of play. My colleague Pasi Sahlberg has written a wonderful book with, I can't remember his first name, something Doyle, on let the kids play, let the children play, I think it's called. Fabulous book.
Yeah, we're actually in favor of removing the word recess, because I think that this idea that learning stops when you go outside and play is, actually a little bit dangerous to what's actually happening. So much
I think well said.
Yes. Out there. Let's get rid of recess and let's just call it outdoor
Sounds
learning,
good.
because I think it's happening out there. I think it's definitely happening. So you've written about, innovators and creating innovators, and I sometimes get a little wary of the word innovator because I'm after a while, it's like, any word, you say it often enough, you kind of forget what it means.
Right.
And I wonder, what's the ideal definition of an innovator?
Well, I had no clue when I started the research for Creating Innovators back in 2010. What all I knew was that that's what people were beginning to talk about.
Right.
I'd interviewed a wide variety of executives starting in about 2005, which resulted in my 2008 book, The Global Achievement Gap, where I really began to understand what were the skills that mattered most and what were the biggest gaps, and why even our highest performing schools weren't addressing those gaps. But as I kept in touch with the business leaders with whom I had interviewed, they kept talking more and more about innovation. And I realized that in writing the 2008 book, I'd missed something. I mean, I'd gotten something right. The 7 survival skills are still so often referred to across the
Yeah.
spectrum in education as being the essential skills that all kids need to master. But more than that, I learned that innovation is vital to our future, our economic future, our environmental future, our social future. So I plunged into this research. And the first thing I discovered, to answer your question directly, is that there's really 2 kinds of research. I'm sorry, 2 kinds of innovation. One kind of innovation is all about bringing new possibilities to life, right? iPhone, Facebook, her though I think it is. And what I learned is that you probably can't educate kids to be that kind of innovator. In fact, Bill Gates, inventor of Microsoft, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, they were all college dropouts. But there's another kind of innovation I learned about, which is every bit as important. And that's the capacity to solve problems creatively, not necessarily with high-tech gadgets. But I interviewed a young woman who left MIT and went to Africa and helped design a simple little grain mill that could be pedal powered and attached to a bicycle. That was solving a complex and important social problem for farmers. Whether it's environment or health or education, whether it's for-profit, non-profit, or in the government sector, more than anything, we need creative problem solvers. Some will be high-tech folks, so fine. Some will be social entrepreneurs wanting to solve social problems. Some will be artists. But creative problem solving is increasingly the corner of realm in the world.
I'm wondering how that squares with the model that we see from teachers who are often forced to teach from a boxed curriculum and eliminate all of the art of bringing themselves to their work. I can't see how those 2 things go together.
Well, I don't think they do. I mean, I think the importance for elementary age educators is to learn from real masters, whether Reggio Emilia or Montessori. But I think beyond that, we come back to communities of problems, practice, solving problems of practice. Right now, today, educators aren't given latitude. They're only given one challenge: get the kids to pass the damn test. And that is the kind of whip, the punitive measure that is on the neck of every educator's backs. And that is more than anything what thwarts innovation today. I think there was a lot more innovation going on in the late 80s, and especially around the Coalition of Essential Schools and other school networks that absolutely died on the sword of so-called accountability, which, as we know, has gotten us nowhere in a quarter of a century.
Right. It doesn't tell us anything about kids. It tells us nothing about kids. So I guess I'm wondering who do we have to convince? I guess I think educators know. I think there are a whole lot of administrators that know. But who is it that we have to convince in order to
That's a
make
really important question. I think a lot of parents intuitively understand that teaching to a bad test is what's undermining the quality of education. Here's my own kind of theory of change since you asked. We got what I call accountability 1.0 because of business leadership. David Kearns from Xerox, Lou Gerstner from IBM. They called for, in fact, a national summit on education in 1996. Do you know how many educators were at that summit, Julie?
I'm afraid to know.
5, and only as observers. Imagine that. What if we called a national summit on business but didn't invite any business leaders? Can you imagine that? So at any rate, they were understandably upset with how ill-prepared our graduates, high school graduates mostly, were for work. And so they thought higher standards was the answer. Well, that became the standards movement. And higher standards meant, throwing more college-level courses at kids who maybe didn't want to go to college. Mm-hmm. Then they thought, well, now we need accountability, right? Well, how do we do accountability? We have testing, and we have consequences for people who don't do well on tests. Well, they forgot a couple of things along the way. Number one, the major problem we have with that educational inequities in this country is a direct result of poverty, something no one wants to talk about. It's 22% childhood poverty rate. It's gone up in the last 4 years, not down, even at the height of a strong economy. So I believe we need to start talking about poverty, number one, as the primary cause of what we see as challenges in education. We need to not think that testing is going to solve the problem. We need to understand that we need to move to a mastery-based approach. The average kid from a disadvantaged background starts 2 years behind comparable middle-class kids, without the benefit of preschool, without the benefit of parents who can read to them, family trips, and so on. And we expect them to magically catch up by grade 12, even when they don't have extra supports or help? No. What if we said instead, a high school diploma is a certificate of mastery, like a collection of merit badges. And in fact, I'm on the board of a new national organization called the Mastery Transcript Consortium that is all about creating a mastery-based high school transcript to send to colleges. And instead of being a collection of Carnegie unit credits and grade point averages and test scores, it's a collection of merit badges. And when you click on a particular merit badge, say in the scientific method, it'll take you straight into a student's digital portfolio that will show you the work the student had to produce to earn the badge. So I think that's moving us towards what I would call accountability 2.0, where we're not going to go back to the old days of no accountability. The issue is, can we educators demand that we be held accountable for what matters and not assume that we're always going to be able to catch every kid up in the exact same period of time? I want to have a button or a bumper sticker made for every educator that says, hold me accountable for what matters most. And I deeply believe new generations of business leadership need to work with educators to define the outcomes that matter most, to create a mastery-based curriculum instead of a time-based or time-bound curriculum with the inevitable bell curves, and to also create mechanisms for collaboration. Because along with having clearer outcomes for which we are accountable, we need better mechanisms for working together as educators. As I mentioned earlier, we educators need to work together to solve critical problems of practice. And in the process, we create a kind of reciprocal and relational accountability in our team, which is actually a better driver of quality and excellence than can any test ever be.
Boy, sign me up, and I'll take 6 bumper stickers right away.
Well, why don't you have them made?
Great idea.
Putting this challenge out for 15 years.
Seriously? All right.
Waiting for somebody to do it and send me a bumper sticker and a button.
Okay.
I'm an educator. Hold me accountable for what matters most.
I love it because I think that educators want to be held accountable. I think
we're completely willing to, if we believe it's accountability that is fair, that doesn't assume we're going to catch poor kids up at the same rate that rich kids are already gone by, and that is embedded in the notion of continuous improvement.
Yeah.
Formal evaluations in education do almost no good whatsoever, from what I can see. They may weed out the worst 5%. The real engine of continuous improvement is these communities of practice solving problems of practice, team-based reciprocal accountability. You know, companies have figured that out 25 years ago. Why are we so behind?
Yeah. Yes. Um, you know, at Slate School, we're focused on trying to help kids learn how to think instead of what to think. You know, I'm sure, you know, we're not alone in saying there's not one big book of knowledge. And I think you talk about how, you know, although there can be complications with, you know, the internet and having ready information, it certainly makes no sense to tell everybody that they have to learn this big book of knowledge when it is available. And I wonder, I wonder how we encourage teachers who may have little autonomy to try and bend the edges of what they get to do in the room to teach how to think instead of what to think.
Well, that goes back to my earlier suggestion of having every student keep a question journal. And then a little bit of time, maybe a couple of hours at the end of the week, maybe a couple of weeks or so, or a week at the end of the semester, you meet with each kid and you have them circle the question or concern that's most on their minds, and you give them the time and space to research it. And you don't do it for a grade. Call it credit, no credit, or advanced credit, credit, no credit. The accountability is they will have to come back and report to their peers on what they learned. And countless educators have done this. And you can do this in spite of the most rigid kind of curriculum. You kind of, as you said, sneak it in around the edges.
Awesome. I know when kids work on their own projects, they're so motivated and they're able to build skills that they weren't really interested in building because they're seeking something that they're passionate about.
Yeah. You know, it comes back to the importance of intrinsic motivation. You know, we don't want to talk about motivation in school. How do we motivate kids? Carrots and sticks, rewards and punishments. That's really the purpose of the grading system. Doesn't do much for kids, but it's other than scare them and increase their anxiety. So I think the challenge is that we create these opportunities for kids to explore things that may strengthen their intrinsic motivation. In the internet era, I'm fond of saying, look, academic content knowledge still matters. Still matters that you know stuff.
Right.
And there's an element of E.D. Hirsch's work that I think is proving itself to be true in the development of early literacy. But in the internet age or in the innovation age, skills matter more. The skills of thinking critically, communicating effectively, working collaboratively. And I would argue motivation matters most. Because if you are intrinsically motivated, you will continuously acquire new content knowledge and new skills all your life, which is an absolute precondition for thriving in the 21st century.
Maybe we can encourage teachers to have their own projects too.
Oh, of course, I would love that.
So incredibly valuable. We do that here at Slate School. We're working on projects the same as the kids.
That's great.
I learned a lot about citrus fruit. It was absolutely fascinating.
Fabulous.
But that subject aside, I think we have a unique time here. This is a unique moment.
Yeah.
You know, you began your career in a unique time as well.
Exactly.
And I wonder how much of who you are is rooted in that and rooted in those experiences, and how we might encourage people to, I don't know, live life a little bit during these years, get involved with things that they care about, because it's not taking a break from your career path. All of it is part of your career path.
Yeah.
I mean, if I learned anything from reading your book, it's that every single thing matters. Every experience matters.
Well, one piece of that, which you very generously left out is how many mistakes I made.
You're
And
awesome.
how so much of my learning was trial and error. And so I think one of the challenges that we need to teach kids as well as practice ourselves as adults is to keep front of mind that so much of learning is trial and error. How do we learn to talk? How do we learn to walk? How do we learn to ride a bike? That's all trial and error. But we don't allow kids to make errors today. They get marked down the more errors they have. So that's another whole challenge is the grading framework that we use in education. But I think adults are as much a victim of that grading framework as kids. We're all afraid of the F word,
Sure.
failure, right? So I think the more we can rid ourselves of the notion of, oh my God, if I try something new, I'm going to fail. Instead of understanding that most important learning is trial and error. You know, when I speak in large keynotes, I ask people to raise their hands if they've learned more from their mistakes than their successes. Well, every hand in the room invariably goes up. And then I turned it around and said, well, then why do we penalize kids for making mistakes instead of them turning into learning experiences? So I think this anxiety, which I think especially afflicts educators, having grown up in this world where we're always being graded and marked, um, takes a heavy toll on the sense of freedom of trying something new. I also think the moment right now, without being political, the moment is ripe for fresh starts. The moment is ripe to overcome some of our adversarial and intensely uh, dark, dark attacks on one another. And the more I think we can be a little bit more generous, not just towards ourselves, because I think it starts with that, but also towards others around us. You know, there's a wonderful line from Midsummer's Night's Dream. Forgive me, I'm a recovering high school teacher, but I have to remind. Uh,
Recovering actor.
when Puck says, "Oh Lord, what fools these mortals be."
Yes.
I've seen completely different interpretations of that. I've seen that said with the most cynical sneer you can possibly imagine. Oh Lord, what fools these mortals be. But I've also seen it said in the most celebratory fashion. You know, oh Lord, how foolish we all are.
Yes.
We are imperfect by nature and so often foolish. And the more we can learn to laugh at a little of our foolishness, and I had to learn that. It took me a long, long time to learn that. I was an earnest young man, and learning, and I don't even think I wrote enough about this in Learning by Heart. Learning to laugh at myself was just essential, still is. And my grandchildren help me a lot with that right now.
I think you learn a lot of that from being a teacher, actually, because kids love to see their teacher make a mistake. And it's a great thing, actually. But it's a funny thing, you talk about that, and yet teachers are so reflective. Like we're always looking at ourselves and saying, "Oh, how could I have done that better?" They're so, it's so
Self-critical, yeah.
heavy on ourselves, so
But that
heavy.
goes back to collaboration. You know, I had this wonderful experiment. I was a part of it at Punahou School, where Obama went in Hawaii, and I was invited to come in and work with veteran educators on how to use videotaping their lessons as a way of self-improvement.
Mm-hmm.
So we had this volunteer group, and I asked everyone to come with a video around a problem of practice they were working on, not a video that showed them how great
Right.
they were. And so I created this little protocol where the person whose video it is gets first comment, right? You don't pile on. And then secondly, the second thing to say is one or two interesting things you noticed about the video. And third, one or two suggestions or thoughts you might have had or questions even. So we developed this protocol. The educators over and over again, when we did the final evaluation of this 3-day event, said they had learned more from their peers telling them what they had done well than they had actually benefited from the critiques because they didn't know what they were doing well because they're all alone.
Wow, that is powerful. That is really powerful. Um, I'm looking at the clock, and there's so little, there's so many things and so little time. I want to just ask you a little bit. Slate School is a K-6 school currently, but we're going to open an upper school.
Great.
I know, I'm so excited. So we're very small, 70 students in our K-6. We'll have 90 in our 7 through 12. But just thinking about, we want our education for kids to be unsiloed. And yet there are so few models for that out there.
Yeah.
The ones that are there are fantastic. And, it's a head scratcher a little bit why that's not commonplace. Why is that not widespread?
Well, I think college admissions has dictated the high school curriculum for a century, college admissions requirements. And the high school curriculum frequently dictates the middle school curriculum. So it's a cascade downward.
Mm-hmm.
That's one reason why we created the Mastery Transcript Consortium, to work with college admissions folks to kind of fundamentally help them rethink how they best can evaluate each young person's uniqueness through this different kind of transcript. Mastery.org, for those of you who are looking for the URL. And so I do think pushing back against college admissions is the challenge if you want to break out of the silo. And of course there are entire schools organized around interdisciplinary courses like High Tech High, which we feature in our film, Most Likely to Succeed, and many, many others. So it's not as sort of completely outrageous as one would think. In fact, what I learned about innovation is that there's not a single problem you can understand, let alone solve, in the context of an individual academic silo. Innovation by nature is interdisciplinary. And so we have to prepare kids to be these creative problem solvers, which means giving them interdisciplinary experiences throughout their schooling.
Because I don't know about you, but I don't start my day in the summer and I say, well, now my language arts part of the day is complete. I'm going to move on to my science part. Now my math part. So exactly. The world, it doesn't. Yeah,
our brains aren't bifurcated that way, fortunately.
Yeah, exactly. There was a big announcement yesterday by College Board.
I saw that.
Yeah.
It was actually a double-edged sword, in my opinion. First of all, before we go to the College Board announcement, the really exciting thing is that there are now 1,600 colleges and universities that are test optional.
Mm-hmm.
University of California system said no more SATs, no more ACTs permanently. University of Chicago said these tests are too biased, we're not going to use them for admissions.
And I think actually they're not. Yeah, go ahead.
Harvard this year gave up on them for the year. So the good news is that we really are, for the first time, I think, historically, in a position where we can look at alternatives for college admissions applications. If, for those of you who are interested, go to Fairtest, one word, fairtest.org for those lists of schools that are now completely test optional. So I think it's a great new opportunity. College Board, they're responding to the market. There wasn't quite the same market for 27 subject content tests, but some of us who've analyzed this actually think that's going to mean even more pressure and emphasis on advanced placement exams, which are horrible. Talk about what to think, how to think. I'm a big fan of the international program.
Oh yeah, IB schools.
Yeah, IB schools, because they really give kids tremendous latitude in doing extended independent projects as a part of their studies. And I was interviewing a group of kids in a private school, some of whom were taking both APs and IB curriculum.
Uh-huh.
And I asked the kids, so what's the difference? And it's just as you were saying. One kid pipes up and says, well, advanced placement courses teach you what to think. International Baccalaureate teaches you how to think.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And I don't even think college admissions people are that tickled with the result they get from the essay.
No, in fact, there's a growing trend.
Yeah, they're not finding people. They're,
there's also a growing trend among colleges to not even give academic credit for advanced placement tests. because they find these kids are, it goes in one ear and out the other. They don't have a deep comprehension or understanding.
Well, it's your wonderful high school teacher who's incredibly gifted and talented and ready to teach high school is given this box of stuff.
Right.
And I don't see how it could be good. I mean, it would take someone really, truly extraordinary.
Yeah.
I don't. Um, so, so, so is there anything that we can do to capitalize on this opportunity when testing is paused? What do we say? Do we?
Well, I think, a lot of parents have seen how boring hybridized learning or line learning is. And in a sense, that's their secret look into how schools work. And so it's time to advocate for more. I think parents need to become much stronger advocates for the kind of interdisciplinary project-based kinds of approaches we've been talking about. Simply asking the question, how is this curriculum strengthening intrinsic motivation while also teaching important skills? Right?
Yeah.
Comes back to that. That's the question every parent should be asking of every school meeting.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I think parents do need to become advocates for accountability 2.0. We educators can't do it by ourselves. Beyond all of that, I think parents need to let go of some of their anxiety. So many parents today are so fearful. They see a far more competitive world than the one they grew up in, and they think their only way to give their precious children a real competitive advantage, and who doesn't want to have your child have that, is to get them into the right school, which gets into the right college, which gets them into the right job. Well, that just doesn't work that way anymore, Julie, as you know. The real competitive advantage today is not being from the right school. It's knowing who you are as a person, having strength and integrity as a learner, as a listener, knowing what kind of contribution you might want to make to the world. And when a young person can get up and say those things with confidence in a college essay or college interview, that's so much more important than just getting into the right schools. Increasingly, first of all, it's impossible to get into the most competitive Ivy League schools now. And, I'm sometimes asked, well, what's your advice if I wanted my child to go to Harvard? I say, well, move to North Dakota, rediscover your family's Native American roots, and have your child discover the cure for cancer, and then maybe you'll have a chance. Because the kids from all over the world who are talented, who are competing. So the issue now is not getting kids into this small handful of the right schools. It's ensuring that the kids leave high school and then college with the right skills.
We're lucky too. We have a country that's filled with wonderful schools.
Oh, fabulous.
And for the people who look beyond that short list, they often find something that is far more right for them.
Yeah.
And
Well, I'm an example. I dropped out of 2 colleges. I finally discovered this very small experimental college, which I write about in my memoir, where I studied social problems, which is exactly what I wanted and needed to do in the 60s.
yeah,
And I had to keep a journal. And then I had to do a huge, long, culminating paper, a semester-long paper, which, I actually published articles from at the age of 19 or 20. But my point is that I think it's precisely because I came from such an unusual background that the Harvard Graduate School of Education sort of said, sure, come on, come here. Your transcripts doesn't have any grades in it. We don't care. Oh, yeah, well, there were the transcripts. I never sent them for my first 2 colleges, but never mind. They would have been all failing. So at any rate, it's the individual who's really pursued their own path, whom I think often stands out and actually has a better competitive advantage. And right now today, interestingly, no one ever asks me where I got my undergraduate degree, ever, or what my SATs were, ever, which is a good thing because they were stunningly mediocre.
I tell parents when they want their 5-year-old to be able to read. I said, when you go to the mall and you see people walking around the mall, do you say, "Oh man, look at that guy walk. He must have been a really early walker." He
that's a
amazing.
wonderful analogy, Julie.
And it's the same, right? It's the same. It's the same.
Right.
I know you say in your book that you didn't think that your life as a writer would be like the life of a writer you imagined, the traditional, the classic life of a writer, and yet you've had quite a life as a writer so far.
Well,
How do you think it? How do you think it compares? What do you think?
you know, I grew up reading the great novelists, the great fiction of the 20th century and 19th century, Russian, American, elsewhere, and I wanted to be a novelist. I fell in love with writing at a pretty young age, and I was fortunate enough to have one teacher along the way who helped me out. It was actually not even my regular academic English teacher, it was extra credit. It was an incredibly important story for me. But somewhere along the way, I stumbled into writing, first of all, about the ecology crisis, which was my senior dissertation as an undergraduate, and then beginning to write articles about education. And lo and behold, they got published. And I was kind of shocked. Didn't expect that. Still went to creative writing workshops, Breadlow's Writers Conference, still clinging to this idea that I would somehow become a writer of fiction. In fact, my first year of my doctoral program, I wrote 3 drafts of a coming of age novel. And, I hadn't given up at the age of 39 or 40. I was a slow learner, very slow, because it turns out I had no talent for writing fiction. But I continued to love the tools of fiction writing. And so when I wrote this memoir, which is my 7th book, didn't really have any new arguments to make, but I had lots of stories to tell. And I wanted to use all of the tools that I love so much about what makes stories come alive, dialogue and description and alliterative kind of phrases and passages. And so that's the fun I had writing my memoir. It just kind of unleashed that wannabe novelist in me and gave me a new palette, a new playground to work within. And I should mention, I narrate the book as well. And I'd never narrated a book before, but I'd always loved reading aloud to my kids every night, foisting poems on my students. So to me, the opportunity to narrate my own story was another incredible joy that I never expected to have happen. And so both writing and narrating the book was just an incredible pleasure.
Oh, great. I love it. I know you've got a hard deadline, but I still want to ask you. You've collaborated now with Ted Dintersmith, and I'm curious. What does that look like? That collaboration, and what have you learned from each other?
Oh, I think that's an interesting question. Ted is always and so often deferring to me. He tells the story of how, he'd gone around talking to all these people in 2010 or so about, what are the best books to read in education. And everybody said, well, read Tony Wagner's book, School of Achievement Gap. And lo and behold, he read it and he called me up or emailed me, I think, and said, can we have breakfast? And I said, well, sure. And so that breakfast turned into a 3-hour discussion, which then ultimately, the fruit of which was the film we did together, Most Likely to Succeed, and then the book. But hey, look, collaboration is hard. It's hard work. And Ted and I had our serious bumps in the road. But guess what? We're still collaborating. We're talking about putting together an educational podcast of a very serious kind. So we're working on new opportunities and new projects now. What is it? Oh my goodness, 10 years later. So, and there were times when, frankly, we weren't collaborating at all. We'd finished the book, finished the movie. He was going his way, I was going mine. But ultimately, he came from a business background. As you know, he was a former and very successful venture capitalist.
Yeah.
And he had a PhD in mathematical modeling from Stanford. But his minor had been education. And so, he was no ordinary mathematician, to put it mildly.
That's for sure.
And me, I was math phobic. Sadly, another unfortunate kind of byproduct of my schooling. So I think it was a little bit of a yin and yang. I think we learned a lot from each other. and the collaboration was kind of greater than the sum of our two parts.
Beautiful. I think, that's always, well, I'll say that's often the
But
response.
good marriages are, right, or good friendships.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, so I want to finish on a positive note. Who is doing well? Who's doing education well? And what should we be learning from them? What should we be learning from them?
There's so many pockets of excellence now, and I'm no longer as in touch with as many of them because I'm not traveling as much or not in schools as much. But I mentioned the Mastery Transcript Consortium. I think they have tremendous potential for being a positive force for change. Recently came across a couple of other really interesting new startups. Uh, Better World Ed is another great little startup um, driven by a young man who's gone around the world making these videos of people in their daily lives from a dozen countries. And he's deliberately not created soundtracks for any of them. You would enjoy showing some of these wordless videos in your school.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
it invites the kids in to understand a little piece of a daily life somewhere in a faraway country. It creates curiosity, it creates interest, it creates, I think, ultimately a certain kind of empathy. And then he builds math and literacy lessons around these stories. So, there's so many young people doing such great work. Just got off a Zoom before you and I started with another young woman starting this great new network of K-20 educators. I think the website may be just k20educators.org. Every time I turn around, I'm bumping into these amazing young people doing these extraordinary startups. And I'm privileged because, they often look to me for advice, for better or worse. But so I'm discovering them all the time. So I don't have any kind of one best other than the Mastery Transcript Consortium. What I have is amazing young people I meet every single day who are really making significant contributions.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Tony, I know we're coming toward the end of our talk together, but I would be remiss if I didn't invite you to come and visit us at Slate School.
I
If
would
you
love to. I don't know where you are, though. Are you in
we're in North Haven, Connecticut.
Oh, okay. Great.
North Haven, Connecticut.
I look forward to it, especially as you build your school out.
That's
I
great.
love visiting small K-12 schools. Keep in mind the axiom of Deborah Meyer, one of my great
Oh,
heroines.
I had a conversation with her. She's
Oh, I know you did. It's one
yes.
reason I signed up to be one of your guests.
I'm
At
gonna
any
tell you.
rate, as you well know, she was a MacArthur Genius Prize winner. She was an amazing elementary educator, then became a high school educator, wrote an incredible book called The Power of Their Ideas. But she, a long time ago, told me, a high school teacher, really, high schools should look like good elementary schools. And I'll end on that note.
I love it. I love it. Well, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. We appreciate so much you coming on tonight. I know that people everywhere are buzzing about this conversation, and I'm sure they're encouraged. And I think that's an important part of what we're doing.
I agree. It's
they're
these sparks of light. Thank you for your wonderful questions. They were really terrific. Just a
oh,
final note, to let people know that you can find me on Twitter at Dr. Tony Wagner, and I try to tweet out articles that I think will be of interest to educators and parents or other things of interest. And my website, of course, is tonywagner.com, where you can learn more about any of my books. But
and read
Julie,
them all.
it's been terrific talking with you.
I loved it. Tony, thank you so much.
My
And I'm
pleasure.
going to end as we end everything here at Slate School, every meeting, with just sending everybody some positive rice. Positive
We
rice.
all need it, right?
Positive. We all need it. Positive rice. Have a great night, everyone. And thank you again, Tony.
Bye, folks. Thanks, Julie.
Take care.
It was fun.
Same
Bye-bye.
here. Bye.